Welcome and good afternoon. I'm Andrew Blauvelt, director of the Cranbrook Art Museum and curator of the exhibition Hippie Modernism, The Struggle for Utopia. This is the last day of the exhibition on view here at Cranbrook as it makes its way to the West Coast to the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive in California. Sorry, my computer's talking to me. Go away. The project actually will have encompassed, by the time it ends, will have encompassed about 7 years of activity from its conception to its completion. So I guess it's like a child ready to be sent off to boarding school. I'd like to thank the staff of the Cranbrook Art Museum for the care and feeding they have provided for the exhibition over the last 4 months. And I'd also like to thank curator Laura Mott for help in organizing today's symposium. I'm very excited by it, and I hope you will be too. It's sort of our last opportunity to go do a little bit deeper dive into the content of the exhibition. I'd, of course, like to thank PNC Financial Services Group for their support of the exhibition here at Cranbrook. They're a great supporter of things at Cranbrook. And so just in terms of the schedule, we'll have four brief talks this afternoon, a coffee break, in which cookies are promised, and a moderated question and answer session with the audience following. Hopefully you've had a chance to see the exhibition, and if not, there should be an hour or so left at the end of the symposium, so you can take one last look and have one last encounter. I'd like to introduce all the presenters now, and then we'll invite them up after each talk to keep it kind of fluid. I'm very excited by today's presenters for various different reasons. I'll be presenting a brief kind of overview of the idea for today's symposium, Free Radicals, and then I'll be followed by Lorraine Wild, who is a designer, educator, historian, and is the founder of Green Dragon Office in Los Angeles, known for its award-winning publication designs. She also serves as a creative consultant for the Los Angeles County Museum of Art and teaches in the graduate program in graphic design at CalArts. She's, of course, studied design here at Cranbrook Academy of Art, received her MFA from Yale University in graphic design. Of course, she has written extensively on graphic design history and was a contributor to the catalog, and we'd like to welcome Lorraine back to campus. Following Lorraine will be Esther Choi, who's a multidisciplinary artist and writer, editor of Architecture at the Edge of Everything Else, and has taught in the departments of criticism and curation, or curatorial practices rather, photography and interdisciplinary masters in art, media, and design at the Ontario College of Art and Design in Toronto. Is currently completing her PhD at Princeton University School of Architecture, the interdisciplinary program in the humanities. She has studied at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and holds an MFA and BFA in photography from, respectively, Concordia University and Ryerson University in Canada. And Esther is actually also a contributor to the catalog, and is one of the, I could say, younger scholars in this field of activity, which I've been talking to various tour groups about, that this period in art history is very fertile ground for a lot of historians, and she's been doing some amazing research work in that area. So welcome, Esther. And our last presenters will be Richard Newman and Liza Bielby of the Hinterlands, who since 2009 have created theatrical performances that explore cultural memory, collective history, and the body. Their productions have been staged at the Shanghai Biennale, the Berlinale, the Legion Arts, the Detroit Institute of Arts, and the Museum of Contemporary Art Detroit, among many others. The Hinterlands' most recent work, The Radicalization Process, was described in Hyperallergic by critic Rosie Sharp as, quote, an absolutely original and radical performance, one that questions the structure and limits of theater as much as it brings to light the politics that have shaped and damaged modern-day society, unquote. Additionally, the Hinterlands are artists in residence and program curators of Playhouse, a Detroit neighborhood-based performance space that they manage in collaboration with Powerhouse Productions. I was pleased to be able to finally, much delayed, viewing of that performance last night, and so of course, it's still resonating in my mind and in my eyes. It's quite an important production, I think. So welcome to Cranbrook. So I think all the housekeeping's done. So I'd just like to give a little brief introduction. So the title of today's symposium is Free Radicals. In chemistry, the free radical is an atom or group of atoms containing at least one unpaired electron, which exists for a brief period of time before reacting to produce a stable molecule. At least that's the dictionary definition. I somewhat remember it from chemistry class. But I'm particularly drawn to what is a transient state of the free radical as a temporary condition as it seeks stabilization. Read metaphorically, a state of radicality, whether that's cultural radicality, political radicality, or social radicality, is destined toward a stable state. The precise nature of this stable state and how it is achieved is a framework for understanding the legacy of the counterculture. Was the counterculture a brief eruption within an otherwise stable social-cultural matrix that regained its equilibrium? Or was the counterculture more like a virus that changed the very nature of the social-cultural matrix in ways that are only now beginning to be understood? The title Free Radicals is also a reference to the liberatory discourse of the counterculture, free as in freedom, but also free as in the ethos espoused by anarchist groups, libertarian groups, and anti-capitalist groups of the period, such as the Diggers, the Yippies, and Provo, all of which have representation in the show upstairs. So I'm hoping that today's speakers that will be able to kind of unpack notions of radicality. It's a kind of term that's, of course, been in widespread circulation since, for a very long time, but definitely since the counterculture. But its meaning has been heavily contested in terms of what is possible within the scope of what it means to be radical. So for my presentation today called Radical Bodies, I'd actually like to focus on a work that's actually not in the show that I wanted in the show. And that piece is by artist Paul Tech. Here in this photograph by Peter Hujar, he's documenting the process of Paul Tech making a project called The Tomb here, which is an effigy of himself as a kind of hippie or countercultural figure. It's an installation-based work. This is the exterior, and there's I don't know if there's any exterior views in color, but I will read a description of that briefly to explain what we're looking at. So this is the exterior ziggurat structure of the tomb, and inside this would have been the view of that figure. And this was created in 1967. It was an installation at the Stable Gallery in New York, actually in September of '67. It would go on tour and was displayed in London in 1968, New York in 1969, and Minneapolis in 1970. Most of what is known about it in terms of a sensual description is by Robert Pincus Witten, who is writing in Art Forum documenting the project. And I'll just quote him here as a description of it. One enters a spacious, rosy lit and incense haze from which rises a large three-tiered ziggurat. Passing through the short entrance, one arrives at a shallow parapet like the interior of a glass phone booth, through which one peers into the dim pink light of the burial site of the artist's wax simulacrum. The effigy is stretched out before us. The dead artist has been interred with unction. All is petal and American vermilion pink, the light, the garments, the tomb interior, the shoes. Tech's stringy blonde locks had been casually brushed from his forehead, revealing a dead mask, eyelids closed, and a dark plagued tongue flopping upon a half-parted mouth. Tech's long, gingham mustache, his lashes and lids have been painstakingly fitted, hair by hair, into the wax mask. Absolute fetishism. Which is then the subtitle of his piece in Art Forum. And there is Paul Tech posing with his effigy. So that's a close-up. I have to go backwards to read this description. So absolute fetishism, almost too real, it seemed to refuse to be art. That's a quote of the time. Another quote, manifesto against that part of contemporary art which reduces art to abstract acts, to operations, and into an absence of hand, unquote. So what is this figure? What is this work? It's more figural than abstract, more corporal than conceptual, more spiritual than profane, more contemporary than ancient, more installation than sculpture, more symbolic than literal. But what or who has been buried? What has been entombed? It could be text's spiritual double. The countercultural figure is an adopted figure of a spiritual double. It could be everyone's countercultural other. And was it an end of one phase and a beginning of another in his career? So again, this is the detail. Now, interestingly, at the same time, in October of 1967, in San Francisco, the Diggers, who were espousing the Free Society, staged their last performance also called Death of Hippie. So Tech's work, it's officially known as The Tomb, but it became, the title became a shorthand as The Death of a Hippie. And this is the funeral announcement, so this would be the invitation to participate in the Diggers' performance piece, The Death of Hippie, Birth of Free Man. And in the exhibition upstairs, there's a very rare documentary film made by Alan Willis in San Francisco. It's a silent cinema verite style film that documents that process of the Diggers building the coffin, it being carried through the hate, and then symbolically set on fire at the end. So the Diggers had taken their name from 17th century English movements to reclaim common lands from sovereign powers. It was a battle for access to what we today call the commons. They espoused a philosophy of free, an action that was, in their minds, the one thing that advanced capitalism and could not be co-opted. Their free stores challenged the notion of private property and capital exchange of goods. Their free food programs acted not as charitable deeds, but rather as acts of individual responsibility on both the part of who provides and who receives. The events and projects that the Diggers stage merged the political and the cultural, the performative and the participatory. It blurred or erased the boundaries between artist and audience, performers and participants. In this way, their actions were forms of an aesthetic radicalism, merging the political radicalism of the time with a corresponding cultural program. Here's a detail of that performance. Now, the Diggers' performance, The Death of Hippie, was actually part of not only the death of something, but also the birth of something else. So on October 6, 1967, the Diggers created the birth of many free philosophies. The free city, the free street, for example, would follow. So here's a quote from one of these flyers produced by the Diggers. "Media created the hippie with your hungry consent. Be somebody. Careers are to be had for the enterprising hippie. The media casts nets, creates bags for the identity-hungry to climb in. Your face on TV, your style immortalized with soul in the captions of the Chronicle. NBC says you exist, ergo I am." So, or later on, you are free. We are free. Do not be recreated. Believe only your own incarnate spirit. Be, create, do not be created. This is your land, your city. No one can portion it out to you. The hashberry was portioned to us by media police, and the tourists came to the zoo to see the captive animals, and we growled fiercely behind the bars we accepted. And now we are no longer hippies, and we never were. And the city is ours to create from, to be in. It is our tool, part of the first creation which the free man creates his new world from. So the Diggers, of course, this is an earlier performance from 1966, colloquially called The Death of Money. So this was the beginning of the espousing the concept that what could be given away for free, or what could exist as free, quote unquote, could not be co-opted by commercial culture. And commercial culture included the art market. So this is a set of terms. Interesting writing at the same time was a gentleman, Stuart Hall, who would go on to be one of the founding fathers of the field of cultural studies. And he was working in Birmingham at the time, interested in what was happening in American counterculture in terms of the hippie scene. So here, this is a list of terms, descriptions, contrasting straight, meaning mainstream, not sexually straight necessarily, and hippie culture. Oops, go back one. So the image of the hippie was not only one circulated by mainstream media, which the diggers were protesting, it might be adopted by others, even other people within the counterculture. And the image was also subject to critical study and appropriation. So, for example, in the Italian radical architecture group Superstudio, would begin to appropriate images that would appear in popular culture, where the hippie becomes a symbolic figure, a figure of nomadicism, of freedom of movement, of freedom from a life of objects, or captured within the net of late capitalism. So here, the life without objects is kind of the sub-theme for the group. But images like this, used in the collage, would have been found in contemporary publications of the time. This is the Brave family, actually. The same is true in other publications, more books. Photographer Anders Holmquist had documented the counterculture scene in California, produced a book called The Free People in 1969. So the image on the lower right would become used as a central piece for Superstudio's From A to Z journey. But the reading of A Life Without Objects within Superstudio is interesting because here, within the grid that they imagined would envelop the world, in which the grid is seen as a democratizing gesture of equal access in space and time. But you get different kind of characterizations of what a life without objects would be. In this case, a life of deprivation following, in this example, kind of post-World War II Blitz kind of image. Whereas they often contrasted the so-called, on the left, the island of happiness. So this would have been the full life of a life with objects in the same sort of grid. Or in the scene of the hippie kind of bacchanal scene on the right, the only those objects which would be necessary for that particular moment's event, in this case, this kind of drunken party. So I'd just like to kind of frame some of the thinking around this notion of radical bodies with looking at bodies themselves. So we have Ann Farm's 50 by 50 foot pillow, which was, this one is the inflatable that was installed for the Freestone Festival in 1970. The body in Repose is an important theme. Repose and being the unproductive body, which then mainstream culture would recast as laziness or sloth, but which was really politically motivated at the time by a refusal to submit the body to productive ends. Or bodies of resistance. So, of course, the very famous bed piece, or the hair piece project that John Lennon and Yoko Ono staged in Amsterdam and Toronto. Or in the Living Theater's Paradise Now productions, which to describe it as a quote here, which consists of a jumble of nonlinear vignettes, theater games, ritualistic exercises, group embraces, and volleys of incantori, anti-capitalist slogans, and other epithets, some encouraging sexual abandon, and of course marijuana use, often culminating with members of the company and the audience taking off their clothes. Now, interesting, Living Theater did perform in Europe extensively, and this is a collage made by one of the other radical architecture groups from Italy, Gruppo 9999, of a Living Theater performance at a space they created called Space Electronic in Florence in 1969. So, what is interesting about this particular space is that it's the By day, or by night, it's a discotheque, and by day, it's an alternative educational space for architects. And it would be the beginning of this kind of hybrid mixed program. But what I talk about in the essay and the catalog is the contrast between sort of the ideas of play that happen against the notions of kind of ritual and protest. And these begin to break down aspects of the counterculture where elements of the political counterculture were wanting, of course, to stage protests, and they did stage protests, but in a fairly traditional way, that of building the kind of barricade. But there was a whole different way that was possible, which was then the commingling of culture and politics at the time. So their program, called Svas, was part of the conceptual architecture program. So again, the body becomes a site of exploration and projection, which could be then fairly free-form. They also experimented within the disciplinary nature of the body in architecture in that space. And the body's very read differently at that time, which would have been the late 60s and early 70s, against the early 1960s, in which the body comes more from a pop art sensibility about leisure and recline and supporting the body, rather than exploring the bodies perhaps differently later, how the body becomes integrated in nature and with the support of architecture and design. And this is kind of famously illustrated in their video, which is in the exhibition called Ceremony, in which they emerge from an underground structure and a kind of space that you never see, and they only emerge out into the natural landscape through these portals, in which the body becomes rather exuberant. The body could also be the site of perception itself and understanding itself. And this became the later preoccupation of a lot of radical architects. This is Ugo La Pietra's Per Ego Basta, which is Enough for Today, is the translation from 1974, in which the artist creates this A-frame structure and then places his body on it in different degrees of different angles, revealing different views of the urban space around him. He called these series of investigations were called unbalanced systems, critical tools to explore the environment anew. This was taken up in earnest by the Global Tools movement, in which, in a series of workshops, this one called Body and the Bounds, the Bounded Body, Body and the Binds is another translation, in the mid-1970s. And this one, the shoes, of course, are concrete, so they place these bodies in quite a lot of tension, of course, close proximity. They would also create prosthetics to explore how the body could be related to one another, but also to itself. And the body became the irreducible site for a lot of designers. Absent the world of objects, what was left? The body as an object. This was also true in the counterculture. This is a project called Life Raft Earth, organized by Stuart Brand, in which there's, of course, inflatables. The inflatable becomes a wall around this parking lot compound, and then the participants inside staging a famine, basically. It's colloquially called a starve-in from 1969. And this would be the beginning to understand the idea of the empathetic body, the kind of aspects of voluntary poverty that would be enacted by the counterculture. So you would have largely middle-class, fairly privileged individuals exercising their rights to refuse that kind of trajectory. Or the emancipated body, the freedom from systematic discrimination or systematic loss within the social system, whether that was the Black Panthers or whether that was the Diggers. The body of sexual liberation. And then, interestingly, a fragmentation of the body when it begins to look at aspects of the senses and the sensual body. So aspects of sight and sound, connection. And I'd like to end with this juxtaposition. So on the left is the Whole Earth Catalog, back cover. On the right, another Paul Tech piece, Untitled Hand with Ring from 1967. But what is the body here? The hand of action or the hand of inaction? The hand is the ultimate human tool. It has the power to shape the future. The whole earth, when it balanced, symbolizes, of course, a whole system. But what does it mean to use it or lose it? It could mean that if you don't continue to practice or use something, an ability, you might lose that ability over time. What's interesting that any self-organized system or self-sustaining system is always in the process of restructuring itself, meaning that it must use it or lose it. On the other hand, no pun intended, or all puns intended, Tech's hand is interesting. It's a different artwork than the one I showed you earlier, but in the one I showed you earlier, he removes the fingers of his right hand, which is his working hand, his primary hand, and those are placed in a pouch around his neck, on the effigies and neck. And this has often been interpreted as the sort of castration of the artist's creativity, that he has lost it and no longer can use it. So on the one hand, Tech's buried one artistic life and rebirthed himself in another, because after he stages the body, or the death of Hippie, he moves to Europe. So on the other hand, Tech did not live to see his art celebrated, having largely been forgotten. He returns to America in the mid-1970s, and all of his work in the 60s is largely forgotten. It's only been revived more recently. So in the death of the hippie, we have the potential of the birth of the free radical, or a stable state demands the death of the free radical as an open question. So does the stable state demand the death of the free radical? And the stable state, of course, a reference to all systems that try to maintain control over society. So I think we'll hear from some other speakers on their thoughts around the exhibition at this time. So I think I invite Lorraine Wild up to join us.
It's not a slideshow.
Oh.
No. I'm going to just hit it. Wait. How do I get it to run it? Wait. View. It's on Navigator. So how do I get it to just...
Sorry, we're just trying to switch over the projection.
About Keynote.
About Keynote, yeah.
Where does it say run as a slide? We just wanted to run as slides that I advance and not as a slideshow.
You want it not as a
It's not
presentation?
showing up
Not
on
on
the
a
screen.
timed slideshow. I just want to advance it with my finger. But it's not.
This one.
Yeah.
Okay, so when we go into this, it'll go and you can
Yeah, but I
advance.
don't want.
I think this is just
Oh,
the
okay,
running.
okay.
It
As
might
long
be
as
the
I
whole
can do
running
it.
time.
Okay. All right. Sorry for the delay. First of all, I want to thank Andrew Blauvelt for inviting me to participate in this symposium. I was really thrilled and honored to be involved in working on the essay for the graphic design aspect of this exhibition, and I'm going to really address that today. And I also owe a thanks to somebody who's not here, David Carwan, back in Los Angeles, who is a designer who, a CalArts grad. He's 2 generations younger than I, and our conversations across time looking at this work was really fruitful for me. Since I'm here in Detroit and I grew up here, I spent my teenage years here, I just wanted to really quickly offer a few images that were of things that I witnessed, because I happen to have spent my teenage years in that kind of flowering of the counterculture here in Detroit, although I was just a hair too young. So for instance, I've been working on a book about Lenny Sinclair, and most of these images are from her, and I'm in that crowd somewhere. This is really meaningful to me. I was underage. My parents probably didn't know I was there. But I saw all this stuff. I saw it really young, and somehow snuck into the Grandie and followed the MC5 and that kind of crazy, ecstatic, and borderline violent aspects of their performances really kind of struck me. It was inchoate for me. I didn't really know how to interpret it, but the energy was so creative, and of course, kind of being in suburban high school, I could only see part of it, although I hung around in downtown Detroit a lot. I certainly knew that I owed some of my inspiration to this person, John Sinclair, and his kind of impresario, acting as a kind of cultural, actually trans practice, trans race, trans everything, events that he launched that were really important. I saw a performance by Iggy Pop that probably changed my life entirely, in terms of, again, the kind of crazed liberation of it. Before I knew any other graphic designers, I was in adoration of Gary Grimshaw, the local, of course, graphic designer who was most responsible for the look and feel of the the invitations and the events and the publications, and that kind of combination of noodly, nerdy handwriting and exuberant color, the kind of rudeness and ridiculousness. There was an aspect of the Detroit counterculture that's just really crazy and ridiculous. As I got a little bit older, I connected that in my head to issues of much higher art practice, beginning to understand things that were going on in the city. I spent my high school, my thesis paper was about this project, and it was at a time when the Detroit Free Press, and I don't know if Marcia's in this audience, but there were articles about what is art in the local paper. So the kind of, thoughtfulness around all this and the collision of these kinds of high and low and pop and not pop. Actually, I was thinking as I was sitting here that in comparison to the bigger pop world of like the Beatles and the Stones and actually Motown and all that, this stuff was just so much stranger and interesting, and it set me up, I think, for always kind of questioning or expecting some other level of engagement out of the work that I knew. So even though I moved way far away from this, in fact, it was a project. I went to Michigan State for my freshman year, and I was in this big seminar, freshman seminar, and they made us build a giant inflatable, and that's why I said, I'm out of here, I want to make books. And so, and that led me to Cranbrook, but I'll come back to that. Anyway, okay, that's over. When you talk about underground graphic design, what you're really talking about is just this whole plethora of posters, independent newspapers, flyers, announcements, educational materials, manuals, tracts, manifestos, that all kind of use more or less the same graphic strategies that were pointed at an audience and came out of the audience, but generally failed to find a place on the narrow spectrum of what constituted quality in the world of professional graphic design. The major cultural impulses that we now associate with the interrelated social revolutions of the mid to late 60s, the civil rights movement, feminist movements, the anti-war movements, all driven by these ideas of personal liberation and the building of new communities, were all supported by an inventive and homegrown graphic design that at the time was really, it was celebrated as kind of like, oh, look what the crazy kids are doing, but it wasn't actually taken seriously. Unlettered graphic design became a lingua franca of the movements, and the look of it served as a signifier of the utopian impulses that were endemic to the 1960s. Whoops, sorry. Content drove the work, and the content was, in almost every case, a challenge to the status quo. And the expression of those ideas in design, use design in a range of aesthetic styles that, while diverse, are kind of formed by common characteristics. One of the things is a density of information. Like if you look upstairs at the material, almost everything is jammed with text. Sometimes you look at it and you think, okay, it's tight budgets. People didn't want to use that much paper, so they just had a lot to say and they stuffed it into relatively narrow space. There's mixed media, there's kind of no borderline between illustration and collage and hand drawing. And clearly the revolution could not be boiled down to kind of simplified mainstream kind of corporate branding, or at least it wasn't understood what that could do, and the ideas are often kind of multi-sided, hypothetical, and visual styles. There's no countercultural design manual, and yet there is such a great similarity. Clearly, the style of these things reflected impulses that meant something to people. Some of it, certainly part of the reason why the mainstream didn't recognize it, and what spoke to, and also what kind of branded it in a way, was the quality of typography. Before the advent of digital typography in 1967, things are still being done analog. Typesetting was actually an expensive thing to have done, and you had to go to a professional typesetter to do it. So and the analog way of creating graphic design was cheap. It's way cheaper than now, where you need an expensive computer to do it. You were just making paste ups. So no specialized equipment, no computers were needed. And then there was low-end equipment like this Gestetner Gestetner printing machines that were kind of like risographs. Those of you who know what that is. The IBM Selectric, where you could kind of set really horribly justified type. All of these things were, and cheap offset lithography, were tools that gave agency to authors, designers, artists, illustrators, and publishers who were really not so concerned with aesthetics, but more with the urgency of their communication, and not, for the most part, on professional graphic design. So underground graphic design, more often than not, appears to be really rough, not as polished as professional design at the time. And it's both a signifier of the alternative means of production and the lack of allegiance to mainstream of commercial or institutional work. The compositional density of many such designs was a visual metaphor for the noise of protest, the cacophony of the free concert, and the accumulation of voices, and the riotous results, all clumsy antithesis to the suave persuasion of advertising and corporate graphic design and commercial publishing. Underground work forges a precise link between its form and function, which is in fact the very credo of modern design if function is defined as necessity. In other words, the very same qualities that make the work authentic and connected to their specific audiences deliberately employed alternative ideas, forms, and processes repellent to the world of mainstream advertising and publishing, and yet embody the ideal of modernist functionalism, thus, I think, the term hippie modernism. Politically radical papers such as the Village Voice or the East Village Other in New York, the Berkeley Barb or the Berkeley Tribe, the Black Panther in the Bay Area, and the Fifth Estate in Detroit were really a product of a generational split, as younger participants rejected the national and mainstream media as irrelevant and corrupt. So the look of underground work, again, connotes a complete lack of objectivity, basically a rejection of the mainstream values attached to journalism and paper, and instead represents a kind of direct involvement of those who are making it and using it essentially as propaganda and as subjectivity. So there's no translation. The messages are really direct. Underground designers were really only concerned with the causes and messages of their young audience, so it's striking in its subjectivity. I've been showing you a couple slides of the work by Emory Douglas, who I think is sort of exhibit A of this issue of using a sort of conventional medium of the journalistic, the newspaper, to speak directly to a community. As you probably know, he was the Minister of Culture in the Black Panther Party, and he also laid out and illustrated their weekly journal. The paper was concerned with issues ranging from social and economic effects of racism on the Oakland community, and then enlarged to a global perspective on the Vietnam War. The pages read simultaneously as op-ed and reportage, with the absolute sense of Douglas making the work from inside of the community, representing the community's point of view rather than, again, imposing or communicating something from the outside. I'm showing Douglas's work here where he created full-page two-color illustrations to punctuate the very dense layout of articles and editorials in the paper. They act as mini posters, usually taking a quote or a slogan of the movement as a starting point. It's political propaganda, but done with graphically economical and succinct visual means, visually really organized in a way that I think comes closest to what we think of as conventional graphic design and the repetitive use of sort of signs and symbols and forms to create a consistent message. But it also, of course, conveys a sense of political emergency, and yet in this kind of almost borderline graphically classical way. And of course, we all know that it's the subject matter that kept Douglas out of the canon of graphic design in the 1960s until very recently. An entirely different practice, but one just as innovative, can be seen in the work of Corita Kent, a Catholic nun, teacher, artist, and communicator in Los Angeles, working in the 1960s. She approached the countercultural practice of graphic advocacy through the unlikely background of fine art printmaking and her exposure to pop art in the Los Angeles art scene. Kent co-opted the already co-opted patois of 60s hip advertising and took the language of commercial consumerism and transformed it into a vibrant picture of spiritual hunger and yearning for love and peace. Combining appropriated, cut-up advertising slogans with meditative journal entries on spiritual hunger and a yearning for peace, she linked the loudness of street signage and the use of posters as protest medium to the of-the-moment desire for political expression, and melding it with a deeply personal communication as well. She always quoted a quote from the Balinese, "We do not make art, we just make everything the best we can." She used this in her teaching, and it really exemplified her movement away from the preciousness of personal expression, and again, the attempt to link a kind of this radical appropriation into into uses of a political language that's really, really deep. It's hard to look at, I find it still kind of hard to look at psychedelic posters, the kind of great ones from the Haight-Ashbury in the late 60s, because they became such a graphic cliche, and I'll go into that a bit more, especially vis-a-vis the Diggers. But so it's such a strange, interesting thing where 5 different designers, I think Victor Moscoso, Wes Wilson, Elton Kelly, Stanley Mouse, all kind of evolved this style that seems like organic and coming right from the community. It allegedly came out of sort of ornate chalkboard notices that were put in front of the various concert venues in San Francisco, which were deliberately made illegible so that the audience that wanted to be there would know what was going on. So it's they actually are very specific visual dialect directed at the locals, the acid-dropping hippies of the Haight-Ashbury. The design of the hard-to-decipher, visually aggressive posters emanates from inside of the intended audience for the events, and there are all these strange gestures like the use of sort of 20s nostalgia, old Western typography, but rendered in colors that make it illegible, that really, end up producing a kind of another visual language. Images meld into letter forms, positive and negative spaces of letters balance in illegible equilibrium with complementary colors used in such balance that they vibrate and induce dizziness. The irony of the reception of psychedelic posters is that while they started out as a secret language meant to keep the hipsters in and the uncool out, they were eventually adapted by the music industry for selling rock and roll and eventually marketing to youths. I'm showing you a bunch of Detroit posters now, the first by Carl Lundgren, the rest by Gary Grimshaw, all for the Grandee, that where they were, guys separated obviously geographically from far from San Francisco, and yet already the style was understood as being attached to these kinds of performances. And again, it wasn't a very, all of the great work kind of ends up happening in and around 1967, but it doesn't take long for the psychedelic style, with just a few tweaks in typography for legibility's sake, to get adapted by, manufacturers of clothing and other items for the youth market. So it does become a sales tool. And if there was any cynicism around the quick commercialization of the counterculture by the man, or cynicism about young people falling for it. Oh, and just a side note, only the Detroit counterculture has stuff with guns in it. I haven't found anything else. Anyway, I think the Diggers graphic design totally exemplifies, again, what Andrew outlined as this rejection of the commercialization and mass marketing of the image of the hippie. So you have this really peculiar graphic output coming out on the Digger side, this kind of anarchist group who were instigating all that street theater and public interventions and anti-capitalist gestures, the free stores, the free food events, and and yet it somehow stands independently from the work that was attracted or was connected to music. It also, I think in a weird way, beautifully, the Diggers graphic design reflects the seriousness of the questions that they were raising about freedom, and especially in a way about the use of public space in San Francisco, which was their most immediately issues of kind of free space and challenging who was going to own those streets. Most of the graphic production that survives is the work of the communication company, or ComCo, as many of the flyers are identified. A Digger joke of a business, which consisted of the two guys I showed you a picture of with their Gestetner, Claude Hayward and Chester Anderson, and it was kind of a trickster mockery of a real ad agency. They actually offered copywriting, design, and printing mostly for street pole positioning, providing most of the ad space for their completely indefinable output. And I'm not showing you the many, many poetry broadsides or philosophical broadsides, the kind of long rants like Andrew showed you, but instead these are the flyers from the things that were kind of really dealing with this question about free space around, but you still see a kind of appropriation, like the seal of the city of San Francisco with the question, how do you want to live, and then other, open invitations to take over space. But there's a kind of, it's almost unlike some of the other countercultural stuff. The aesthetic of the Diggers' work is really random. The Cauliflower, the kind of gay Diggers collective on the side of the Diggers, did use the psychedelic style, and I think it has to do with the kind of bacchanalian or Dionysian aspect of some of the events that they were producing. And so you have some ComCo material for Cauliflower that ends up kind of wandering into that same weird combination of psychedelia and nostalgia. To switch totally into a different mode, the book as tool is the other great graphic trope of the period. We kind of, this idea of what I'd call a meta manual, a whole category of publications that are basically designed and published by persons or groups dedicated to challenging conventional methods of collecting and disseminating information against the strictures of conventional education or the idea of authority. And these books often serve to flatten out the hierarchies that separated educators from the educated, or at least attempted to dismantle a top-down model of the delivery of knowledge toward what we would now call an open source or collaborative model. These manuals usually contain multiple voices and sources that overturn the primacy of one author as the sole purveyor of information, cutting one's dependence from mainstream society often involved the willingness to kind of rethink how you were going to live from the ground up. And so a book like the Whole Earth Catalogue, dedicated to sharing the education skills and experiences that would help build a new world that the underground was dreaming of, utopians hinted at the be-ins and the free concerts, alternative families, communes, and other back-to-land experiences are supported by the production of this kind of material. Clearly, the Whole Earth Catalogue, with its slogan, the access to tools, is, I mean, when it was, I think you could argue that when it's published in 1968, it was probably the most important cultural artifact of the year, again, ignored because the graphic strategy is so against what was going on in above ground magazines and book design, created by Stuart Brand and Lloyd Kahn and eventually an entire collective of people. The books look random, but the layout is completely purposeful. It's non-orderly. There's no grid, no spatial dynamic. It's really labyrinthine, and you're invited in all the material to essentially wander through that giant pile of information, to navigate through this tsunami of content, which is all extremely useful information on subjects as wide-ranging as how to build your own house or grow your own food or birth your own babies. But it's non-hierarchical in that the implicit message is all the information is important and useful, and it's up to you as the editor, as your own editor, to kind of edit themselves. And then, of course, there was the invitation of a kind of participatory engagement so that the multiple issues which are on view upstairs incorporate a kind of feedback, and it's a collective, it eventually ends up as a collective project, again modeling very early the open source. The layout of the Whole Earth Catalogue could not help but stimulate curiosity and imagination, encourage readers or users to get to work transforming the world. And of course, Stuart Brand, as an early advocate of technology as a liberating force, Trips Festivals, a famous event in 1968 that he did with Doug Engelbert called The Mother of All Demos, creates this fairly direct connection between this utopian, unachievable utopias of the hippie era and then the immersive digital technology that we live with today. I am aware that I've thrown in way too much into this talk, and so I just want to go through some of the associated publications of the time that also dealt with teaching and expertise, but again in this kind of amazing do-it-yourself way. So you have Ken Isaacs with his books on furniture, the Zohm primers, Lloyd Kahn's foray into more books about building your own house as shelter, and then the numerous books that tackle the question, kind of early questions of new media and open access to media, the using of video, and other technologies to give people access. One of my favorite things in the exhibition is that first pirate television show, that the video's on view from Minneapolis. In the Catskills, right. And it's tied to this kind of celebration of the, of course, what was deemed to be a portable technology. The Portapack did weigh 40 pounds, so by today's standards, it was a killer, but then it's kind of the opening of the door to experimentation. And I'm going to jump over this as well in terms of, as it's much better known, but the project of Quentin Fiore working with Marshall McLuhan on, and other authors on books where the layout becomes, again, kind of a sort of meander through a subject in as unacademic a way as you can, and sort of connecting the this sort of flattened out hierarchy of information to ideas even of above ground authors. In many locations across the country, radical activists of all stripes published inexpensive, easily distributed magazines. The rules for what journalism was supposed to look like, such as a clear demarcation between fact and opinion, were routinely violated in the hands of the numerous and mostly anonymous graphic designers and artists who cared less about those conventions and more about what they were actually advocating. So provocative visuals added power to alternative ideas. If you could visualize it, maybe it could be materialized. These graphic provocations trickled down to a few slightly more mainstream publications which had national distribution, unlike most of the underground press. More nimble and sympathetic editors, shorter publication schedules, and the need to constantly attract a young audience for advertisers made magazines one part of the above-ground media that did inflect to the underground, at least in a few instances. I have a few images here of Scanlan's magazine, which was edited by Warren Hinkle and designed by Barbara Stauffacher-Solomon up in San Francisco. It only lasted about a year. There were endless censorship issues, and I'll come back to this a bit, but the unique thing about Scanlan's is Stauffacher-Solomon's strategy of connecting kind of above ground, straight Swiss modernist typography like that Helvetica masthead. She'd actually gone to Basel and studied in Switzerland. She's one of the, I think, earlier American graphic designers to go to that school. And yet it's combined with these really impactful, this is the front and back of the famous issue advocating Nixon's impeachment, not for Watergate, but for the Kent State killings. So the kind of graphic strategies here are really strong and direct and hard-hitting. And in some ways, there's a kind of almost an appropriation of advertising or kind of big idea design here visible in the covers for Ramparts magazine that was also edited by Warren Hinkle, where photography is used for shock value or for attention grabbing, not unlike the cover of, say, Life magazine or other, or like Esquire, the George Lois covers, but unlike those where they're kind of staged and in a way faked, this is the 4 editors of Ramparts actually burning their draft cards and then getting arrested for it later. Obviously, the counterculture and the underground press thrived in the youth culture school settings. New experiences and interpretations of art, sex, literature, music, and cinema in combination with mind-altering drugs or not became part of the everyday lives of so many students to one degree or another. A side effect of the campus protests, revolt against campus administrations and law enforcement, and the appalling violence that often erupted was that education now seemed to burst beyond the confines of the ivory tower, and the question of where the classroom and education really happened becomes part of another whole set of question marks and graphic responses to them. This is a copy of a booklet, well, it's actually a magazine published by Sheila de Bretteville titled California Institute of the Arts, A Prologue to a Community. It was a copy of a magazine called Arts and Society. And she was actually not teaching at CalArts. She was just hired to be the in-house graphic designer. And she decided to make a portrait of the school. It's a kind of made up of varied paper stocks and this plain corrugated cover. And it is this visual kind of cacophony of images and essays and scribbled notes, faculty curriculum plans, interview fragments, letters of application, all kinds of things. And again, like the Whole Earth Catalog, the reader is expected to make the connections and to sort of build an idea or a feel of the institution as a whole through this kind of multitude multitudinous copy text. And I forgot to mention, the other thing is that there are many, many images from the news. Television screenshots, again, of riots, of upheaval, of the things that were going on in the background of it all. Sheila is, well, again, her approach is hybridized. Like, to me, her strategy is countercultural. Again, she was a Yale-trained graphic designer, kind of trained in modernism as it was the grid and sans serif type as it was defined at that point. And so you have her using a very kind of straight above-ground strategy for text, but then the overall, editorial organization comes through this much more synthetic state of mind. And that synthetic state of mind, I think, is really sort of presented as a mental map in this document, which is also upstairs, the posters from the Blueprint for Counter-Education, which were meant to be hung and create a kind of educational environment, a diagram, again, similar in density to the Whole Earth Catalogue, that was used to map out the new relationship of theory to practice in a search for a more relevant framework for classroom discussion. These were actually produced by Maurice Stein and Larry Miller of Brandeis, who then went on to found the General Studies program at Cal Arts. And so this mentality, again, of the endless interrelationship of ideas and things, creating a landscape that you then, as the participant, were free to wander across, is incredibly important. So if you as a student interacted by reading the charts, you became an active player in your own education. And while the design of Doubleday's Kit of Parts is accredited to a designer named Marshall Henricks and Stein and Miller, they did assemble the charts over time with the assistance of many students. In other words, these posters are a community endeavor. Again, these are other good examples of Sheila's sort of strategy of thinking. I hope she isn't mad if she hears this. Thinking like a hippie, but designing not like a hippie. Designing with this kind of, again, a kind of sense of the impact that it was achievable through the use of this very disciplined and powerful modernist style. So her response, though, is always to push design toward a kind of person-centered, proactive practice, which built and strengthened individuals while encouraging, again, the formation of new communities. However, with typographic restraint, actually like in this poster, which is comparable to Barbara Solomon of Scanlon's, the pairing of the international or Swiss typography with countercultural subject matter, I think turns out to be a strategy embraced by a few other designers, including the McCoys here at Cranbrook, who were tackling educational projects. Actually, I'm jumping. There they are, the hippies I met around 1972. So in the hands of these designers, modernist typography is recuperated from its tight identification with corporate capital and rehabilitated to express reform via tension between the higher production values that signified the mainstream and then the ideas that clearly came from somewhere else. I mean, the McCoys, after all, were young designers who, when they got here, were working in the mainstream. Mike was at Ford and Earl, the industrial design firm, and Kathy was at Skidmore Serration. This is a poster she designed for the Artists Guild competition of 1971, I believe. But when they were hired to revive a moribund design program, they, like Sheila, linked the utopian countercultural goals of liberation to the notion of research in design and practice, and shaped a synthesis of professionalism that was defined, at least in part, by that countercultural utopianism. This is the first poster used to announce the reformulated program in 2- and 3-dimensional design, and it really represents this hybrid of the underground style of thinking. The poster describes a new model for a more engaged and open-sourced approach to design education. If you read the text, descriptions of projects are about getting out into the community, using video, using documentation, using brainstorming techniques, all of the kind of things that were percolating around in the sort of alternative education universe, and yet connecting it to a lineage and a history of kind of graphic design thinking. So I think this kind of attempt to bridge that gap is why, and actually Sheila's as well, is why those two figures of Sheila and the McCoys are so important now in graphic design. Look to educators looking at what we sense now, I think, is another gap to come. I want to end with this, obviously a crowdsourced poster about a field trip that the Cranbrook graphic design students took across the East Coast in a Winnebago, which of course combines the classic hippie road trip ethos with a really serious deep dive into practices in offices that went from Pittsburgh to Boston. So in conclusion, focusing on communities instead of clients, valuing individual engagement over professional detachment, bypassing top-down hierarchies in favor of feedback and audience engagement, and expanding the visual vocabulary to reflect experience are all factors of underground graphic design that are now accepted in design practice. And while the digital technology that we all use, it was also shaped by some of those countercultural ideas that champion personal computing and networks. The valuing of design process over the products was driven by an urgent desire historically for individual liberation and a creative community. Operating outside of professional standards or approval, new approaches to graphic design practice and education came from the vivid existence of that underground countercultural design. The model of intellectually and aesthetically liberated designers who dedicate their work to projects that genuinely engage them or that they invent, and understands that there is much more to graphic design than the professionally sanctioned model. And I think now, with the historical distance that we have, we can see that the hippie modernist period is the true source for growth in so much design thinking in the last 50 years of American design culture, one that is only being recognized, though, as the ideals of good formal quality and options for practice today have been diversified to the point where nobody can define them. Thank you.
Okay. I'd like to invite up Esther, and then we'll have a little break after that. Okay.
Hello, everyone. So thank you. I'd like to begin with a thanks to Andrew Blauvelt and Laura Mott for the invitation to speak at this event. I'm really excited to be here, and also for the opportunity to contribute to the catalog. So full disclaimer, my presentation in a lot of ways is a response to the process of contributing to the catalog. So I have two interviews, one with an architectural collective from New York called Onyx that were quite short-lived, and then the Viennese architectural collective, Haus-Rucker-Co, and then I also wrote a longer form essay on Haus-Rucker. And so in doing some of this research, which I actually was doing separately, sort of separate from the exhibition, I was noticing as a young scholar the paucity of secondary sources, basically, on this particular historical period. And part of that, I think, is to do with the fact that, technically, if you're doing a PhD, they say that you need at least 40 years distance to, kind of adequately look at a particular given moment or topic. But also, I think that there was something about the work itself which seemed to have a resistance to a certain kind of historical interpretation. So this talk is structured not merely as a kind of critical analysis that looks at some of the architectural experiments of that time, but also a kind of, like in the spirit of the work that I'm talking about, also a kind of proposal. So the second part of my talk might be a little bit more theoretical, but I see a lot of resonance of sort of the ways in which cultural producers are operating today and our relationship to technology. And so I think that there are some really interesting lessons that can be learned. And also, I want to add, though, that the timing of this show of hippie modernism, I think, is really amazing for young scholars to act as a resource, because this kind of archival material is just, it's really amazing how much of it has been amassed for the show. Okay, so radical in its literal meaning in Latin from radicalis refers to something belonging or relating to the root, to its foundations, or to a fundamental nature. Radical implies a type of reform that is not merely a gradual conversion, but rather an abrupt end, a condition that simply bursts or with another in its wake, a kind of change that's closer to a model of transubstantiation in which one thing is replaced by something else, rather than a slow evolutionary process of accrual or entropy. The premise of this symposium, called Free Radicals, is that the architects of the hippie modernism era abruptly unmoored the discipline from its foundations, rather than reinforcing them through the creation of undisciplined matter that metaphorically and sometimes literally left a cloud of smoke in its wake. Indeed, the values of modernism and the international style in particular had infiltrated most major institutions involved in shaping architectural discourse in the first half of the 20th century, from MoMA to Siam, by figures like Siegfried Gideon, Nicholas Pesner, and Philip Johnson. And the rhetoric of the modern movement, as such, had developed its own impenetrable sense of polemical, heroic tenor. So the ebullient architectural activity of the 60s and 70s seemed concerned with shaking a discipline so numbed by and pacified by its own rhetoric and awakening it from its slumber of self-indoctrination. Certainly, this aligns with the standard narrative that most students of art and architectural history have been told. If the first half of the 20th century could be characterized by the emergence of institutions, formalism, technological standardization, and rulemaking, the 60s and 70s were a time of freewheeling, of protest and culture clashing. But part of the controversy that this hippie modernist architectural activity started was over the questions of what is actually at stake. One of the upshots of characterizing this era's architecture as wild, whimsical, and informal is that the work has been largely positioned as a mode of practice or body of thought that stands outside of or against theory. The architectural experiments of this time here, sorry, there was just a message that popped up. I'm going to close that. Something for you, yeah. Okay. As I was saying, the architectural experiments of this time have, for the most part, been outside of or against, the architectural experiments of this time have, for the most part, not been offered serious historical interpretation. They seem both allergic to participating and upholding the traits of what we would characterize as a critical practice, partially due to the fact that its forms are so resistant to formal analysis. The democratic, non-expert status of the architect or designer during the hippie modernist era also seems to run counter to the notion of intentionality and disciplinary critique. Certainly, we would be hard-pressed to think of examples from the show which, if they do, offer models of critique that operate strictly on terms based on negation, annulment, or outright refusal. There's always a kind of projective component to it. Instead, the myriad architectural drawings, models, and publications in the show attest to the seemingly inclusive model of architectural ideas and audiences. It literally is a kind of sponge model that can absorb everything. Indeed, the notion of the collective in architecture itself becomes a sociological phenomenon in this era for a particular reason. It redistributes and diffuses the proprietorship of objects and ideas in favor of the benefits that conversation and information exchange brings, which actually has a lot of resonance, I think, to the kind of maker culture ethos that has come to the fore recently. But it occurred to me recently that perhaps the reason we have struggled to view and explain exactly how and why this particular activity is critical in its own right, both formally and conceptually, is due to the limits of the theoretical languages we have been trained to use in the act of interpretation, and not due to the nature of the work itself. In fact, the 1960s were a funny time in architecture and in the humanities as a whole, precisely because many of the terms and interpretive strategies we've come to use to understand practice as critical developed during that very moment. Thus, I would argue that these apertures for interpretation and analysis were too limited in their scope to fully account for these new forms of practice, which were then emerging in response to significant shifts in global capital and technological advancement. So as much as the 1960s seemed to be a time of celebration and sensory excess, questions of what constitutes theory and criticism became major preoccupations for the enterprise of architecture specifically. In the late 60s, we see speculative architectural activity in North America primarily divided into two camps. On the one hand, there was a retreat to the academy with the emergence of groups like the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies in New York, a group of New York-based architects, historians, and theorists that essentially formed its own mini school. The Institute leveraged its relationships with architecture programs at major universities like Princeton, Cornell, and Columbia to organize itself as a pedagogical think tank institution. This, in turn, would launch the careers of a number of architects and thinkers primarily associated with the rise of architectural theory in the United States, such as Peter Eisenman, Diana Agrest, Kenneth Frampton, and Anthony Vidler, and so forth. And then these people would in turn become prominent educators at the major institutions that supported the Institute. So this retreat to the academy and the development of the Institute in particular was influenced by two major changes that were taking place within American intellectual culture and in US universities. The first was the dissemination and influence of French cultural theory, such as Foucault, Derrida, Deleuze, and so forth, in the university, which also found itself in the discipline of architecture. The second was the gradual reappraisal of architecture as a humanities rather than a technical discipline. So journals like Oppositions, which came out of the Institute, became the birthplace for a new type of architectural writing that tended to decouple a work's meaning from the author's intent. It focused on architecture's intentionless meaning. Essentially, this type of writing was an interpretation of architecture's meaning as a series of signs, symbols, and analogies, rooting its formal basis in a world of language and concepts, rather than its place and effects in the world as such. On the other hand, a network of architects across the globe, many of which are in the show, were engaged in stochastic architectural activity that seemed antithetical to the theory speak and Ivy League elitism of the American East Coast. Several architects I interviewed for the exhibition catalog admitted that the language of the Institute felt impenetrable and only for an elite few. In contrast, the hippie modern paradigm privileged information sharing, pluralism, and collaboration. So rather than perpetuate the singular authorship of the modernist canon, these architects were suddenly forming their own tribes, while also encouraging you to form your own. Resolutely DIY, they borrowed from the whole earth ethos to develop manuals so that you too could create your own inflatable or a dome or a village. This was essentially what Bernard Rudofsky called an architecture without architects. Their architectural work was grounded in understanding the effects of architecture in the world, practically or speculatively, either through a phenomenological understanding or by investigating its interactions with technological and environmental systems, or by leveraging its participation in material culture and communication systems. Affective and accessible, their projects seem to celebrate a sense of bodily immanence captured in the real-time sensory arrangements of total environments and pneumatic structures, and heralded the pedestrian allure of reappropriating accessible cultural formats like comic books and materials like plastics. This architecture was at once everywhere and nowhere, everything and anything. So any student of architecture or design will observe an absence of architectural criticism about this particular strain of hippie modern activity during its time. Most accounts are largely descriptive and journalistic. The architectural experiments of the hippie modernist era offered alternative modes of critique that, I would argue, exceeded the theorist's capabilities at the time. Writing in the 60s, the British architectural critic Rayner Banham recognized a struggle to critically assess this new generation of activity, which seems so antithetical to the values of modernism in material practice and rhetoric. It was instead so acutely focused on sensation, on pleasure, buzzing from the effervescent energy of the broader countercultural movements across the world, which was really epitomized, I think, in the May '68 protests. Still, he couldn't deny its attraction. The real-time responsiveness of inflatable technology, and in particular its tendency to behave like living organisms, was pure seduction. And for Banham, the inflatable's capacity for real-time feedback offered a new lexicon for radical contemporary practice based on user-centered interaction. And here's a bit of a long quote from Banham, but just bear with me. So Banham observed, "In the established critical tradition that so prefers illusion or allusion, such a physically responsive structure, of course, doesn't stand a chance of a fair evaluation. But the influence of that bad old school of Platonic abstraction is on the wane. The kind of direct participation, real space, real-time involvement aesthetic that is replacing it, epitomized in events like light sound happenings, which often feature inflatables, favors this kind of sensitive environment. Quite unlike the relationship with the static shell of a traditional building, where you can beat your fists on the walls and scream and get no more than an echo for a response, here, a blow directed at the enclosing skin would produce a flurry of reproachful quivering and creaking, quickly dying away as even the tenor of its normal breathing ways was resumed. I like that." What Banham rather correctly points to is the paucity of analytic models to evaluate this work, and it's significant that he also identifies the inflatable in particular as an architectural form that defies analysis according to the established critical tradition. So as I mentioned in the Hippie Modernism catalog, I undertook a historical examination of the inflatables of the Viennese art and architectural collective Haus-Rucker-Co, and specifically their installations within museums as a way to think about how they operated critically within these contexts. Today, however, I'd like to zoom out a little bit to examine more generally the continual reoccurrence of inflatables within the 60s and 70s as a whole. And I'd like to use the inflatable and the bubble in particular as a means to challenge the usefulness of this codified image of the 60s. I will argue that the counter to the established tradition offered by the avant-garde, a large portion of hippie modern architectural activity involved a softer form of resistance, using techniques that have since become more familiar to us in the post-internet era. And here I must acknowledge my own argument relies on the work that historian Fred Turner has done in this area, which examines how the period was a proxy for the growing information networks and cyberculture that were then in development. My argument, which is organized into 5 main points, will be that the work was not resistant to or anti-theory. Rather, it's only with a certain exacerbation of certain technological and social conditions that comprise our present time that we can begin to possess a vocabulary for critically evaluating its early strains then. So the 1960s witnessed the decoupling of architecture as a discipline from the profession of building. As recent architecture graduates, many of the collectives featured in the show had no interest in the permanence of building on the failed edifices of modernism. Authenticity and uniqueness no longer seemed applicable as core values. They were replaced instead with a sense of experimentation, ephemerality, a rapid sense of adaptability and communication. The heirs of inflatables, in particular, offered young, recent graduates from architecture schools myriad possibilities for disobeying social, political, and disciplinary conventions. So just as bubbles appeared unmoored and weightless in their constitution, they also functioned as agile and non-committal forms of architectural expression, given their low cost, portability, and functionality. A different reliance on institutions formed as a result. So as an alternative to traditional modes of architectural practice enmeshed in the constraints of client demands, stylistic debates, and bureaucratic protocols, installations in exhibition and event-based formats offered collectives a means to experiment with novel construction techniques, also unorthodox materials and impermanent forms. Their translation of architectural concepts and experiences into more compact spatial formats was symptomatic of the increasing popularity of installation art and total environments at this time, not only for artists but for architects, a development that, for architecture, evolved actually from its own history with exhibition design. By extension, as formats which typically relied on support from institutional platforms, young collectives often leveraged channels of cultural funding, galleries, institutions, and media otherwise available to artists in order to sustain their unconventional practices. The flexible nomadic aspects of pneumatic architecture, its short durational span, and ability to generate ever-changing encounters were its key features. The political potential of these aforementioned projects stem from their ability to effect a rapid rate of change through physical and sensory interaction, which ran counter to the sedate, monumental edifices of modern architecture they so despised. With plastics, the flexibility of pneumatic structures enabled new shapes and arrangements to be formed with ease, intrinsically resisting calcification and stasis. The architectural historian Mark Wigley has suggested that plastic, and he's citing John McHale, exemplifies the constant plastic transformation by which culture now produces itself as a continuous flow, rather than a set of discrete objects. By 1968, the motif and materiality of air had pervaded the fields of art, architecture, and the popular imagination at large. The June '68 issue of Architectural Design, titled New World, which cataloged a variety of pneumatic applications spanning from the aeronautics industry and marine technologies to nomadic satellite structures and inflatable furniture, underscores how the aesthetic dimensions of this technology were intricately bound to the militaristic and scientific basis of its development. Similarly, the 1968 Air Art exhibition, curated by Willoughby Sharp, heralded the art world's attraction to air-rated artworks and the privileging of the kinetic, immaterial, disposable, and commercial environmental, which is kind of epitomized, I think, by the throwaway glamour of Andy Warhol's helium-filled silver clouds. Much in the same manner that pop art provided an opportunity to democratize the distinction between avant-garde production and mass culture, so too did inflatables neutralize the discrepancies between high and low, military and recreation, unique and disposable, professional and amateur. Yet despite the capaciousness of pneumatic technologies in the built environment, it was largely the inflatable's capacity as a carrier of symbolic value that propelled its ubiquity. The sum of scientific, aesthetic, economic, and political vectors, the morphology of the bubble is protean. Operating like a meme, the inflatable's elastic configuration could absorb a range of intents, associations, and purposes, evolving and self-replicating virally across genres, periods, and geographies. So like a meme, the bubble could be retooled in myriad contexts. So while Event Structure Research Group in Amsterdam used inflatables to produce environments for an expanded cinema and haptic experimentation, Ant Farm's do-it-yourself survival aesthetics, epitomized in their Back to Basics Inflato cookbook, featured inflatables as an easily programmable tool to navigate the technological and ideological terrain of the American landscape. Their inflatable production studio, designed for the last issue of the Whole Earth catalog, attest to that nomadic potential of what the critic Banham referred to as that simple windbag, a theme also explored by Artgram in their prosthetic devices for inflated mobility. In the work of Viennese architects like Haus-Rucker-Co, which I showed you earlier, Walter Pichler, Hans Hollein, Coop Himmelblau, and Missing Link Productions, inflatables merged with the influence of body art and performance to produce widely imaginative, biomorphic, and prosthetic assemblages, often enacted in public space. For Florence's UFO group and the Utopie Collective in Paris, the use of balloons as an aesthetic tool of protest symbolized the compressed energy, ebullient anxieties, and utopian dreams of the student revolts, literally and metaphorically about to burst. So similar to the digital tool sets of today, inflatable technology was a formula available to everyone. It offered a system that shared characteristics It had offered a system that has shared characteristics despite the specifics of its particular configurations. In this way, it acted as a symbol of architecture as not being unique, precious, or special. It in fact broadcasted how not special and how generic it was. It is, but it did so at the same time while pointing to all of the other forms that also existed. So while a number of the architects featured in the exhibition produced little magazines, The tenor of their writing differed drastically from the modernist manifesto, which was often filled with regulations and rule sets that sought to preserve the bounds of what is considered architecture. Instead, the writing tended to privilege architecture's expansion, often in catalog formats that celebrated architecture's dispersion in the world's growing media infrastructure, its everywhereness and everythingness. Hans Hollein's manifesto, Alles ist Architektur, in an issue of Bau from 1968, proclaimed architecture's interaction with massive systems of consumption, distribution, and information. This compendium of 30 images culled from the works of Frei Otto and Haus-Rucker, the montages from advertising, magazines, and political imagery. The goal was to liberate architecture from the professional constraints of building and imagine it anew within vectors of commerce, technology, and politics. And similarly, the seminal 1968 exhibition, Structure Gonflable, organized by the French collective Utopie in Paris, showcased the collective's interest in the inflatables' quotidian and visionary associations. It demonstrated, I think quite importantly, a systems thinking approach by displaying a varied assortment of pneumatic artifacts that covered the prosaic, militaristic, scientific, commercial, and speculative uses of this technology. We see architecture flanked by both lawn furniture and missiles. It creates a sense of sameness without resorting to standardization. The catalog format in particular also becomes an ingenious way to draw attention to the isomorphic correspondences amongst vast systems of power, rendering forces visible through an open, dynamic, organizational framework that in some ways mirrors the theory upon which it was based. So here we see architecture's ability to cloak with everything else. And here I'm going to show a series of images of pneumatics used in a variety of contexts, just so you can show sort of how it was all over the place, literally. Architecture here is at once inconspicuous, and at the same time, it's referencing major systems of power and information. And its ability to slip in so casually is what confers its own agency and power. Its ability to both participate in and be a symbol for the real is its elastic configuration. The catalog, like the rendering, the catalog, like the inflatable, is able to kind of stretch to bring in specific aspects of reality. It takes stock of what's taking place in our perceptions and our feelings and creates a kind of scenographic treatment or narrative to present a new understanding of what is taking place. Now, this is a different approach to architecture than what we had seen in the past because it forces us to transcend the scale of the local and connect it to a broader scale of global capital. And this makes me think of a more recent phenomenon that Emily Segal of the art collective and trend forecasting group K-Hole referenced in a talk in 2014. So in her analysis on the future of luxury branding, she actually looks at the example of the MA1, which is a bomber jacket that has become a kind of status symbol. Everyone from Kanye West wears it to sort of like the everyday Joe wears it. And so it's in some ways highly specific and ubiquitous. And it's also imbricated in her argument in relation to a whole series of military and socioeconomic vectors. And so she references Bruce Robbins' concept of the sweatshop sublime, in which she discusses how the garment creates a sense of spatial and temporal oscillation. So the sweatshop sublime is this moment when you have, in her words, a mass-produced object in your hand, and all of a sudden you have this vertiginous kind of moment of realization of all of the different systems of labor and technology, military power and exhibitionary complexes and factories that went into its history and making. And then you zoom back in and you're holding this object in a store. And she describes this kind of oscillation between something banal and specific to something totally overwhelming and gigantic. And I think this has particular resonance to how architecture is presented by Hollein and Utopie, this feeling of being conscious of the entire system of things and conscious of architecture's place within that system. This, in my view, is intimately related to our current state of architecture, which I would say is like there's a growing awareness of how the stuff of architecture, the materials, construction systems, typologies, drawings, renderings, contracts, and so forth, are imbricated in a vast system of infrastructure and networks of capital, biopower, and state power. And this is essentially what makes us fundamentally uncomfortable about architecture. Its elasticity and adaptability as a discipline and profession requires management governed by a sense of ethics, because like the bubble, it feels a little bit dangerous. It's always on the verge of collapse. So my second last point deals with the bubbles, deals with the notion of soft power. Oh, sorry, I'm gonna go through these slides very quickly. All the ways you can use inflatables. Just to show all the vernacular kind of forms. Okay, so soft power. So my final point is on the bubble. On the bubble's power deals with its allure. So pleasure is always seen as deeply uncritical, but I would argue that the power of the architecture of the 60s was precisely in its allure. Soft power is a term developed by Joseph Nye, a political scientist at Harvard University, to describe a persuasive approach to international relations that I would argue is more prevalent and more insidious as a form of political power today. So in his book on the topic, Nye explains that there's a political model of top-down coercion, epitomized by the Bush administration's tactics, in contrast to a model of co-option, where appeal has more influence. So just a very brief little case study. So in Haus-Rucker-Co's 1970 installation entitled Live, soft power comes to the fore. At their first major museum show at the Vienna Museum of the 20th Century, the inflatable was a provisional playground and social sculpture designed to foster social engagement in an institutional context. It involved the design of a 225 square meter inflated air mattress placed in the center of the museum's ground floor, accompanied by 3 giant PVC billiard balls. So visitors were encouraged to walk on and interact with this malleable, responsive membrane. The installation was a resuscitative exercise to inject vitality into what the collective perceived as the dead space of the museum. Now, there are other ways we could interpret the work, too. Authorship also became a locus for contestation. The gallery space became the group's living and working quarters, visible to the public for 3 months. So by enlarging the apertures between production and exhibition, the collective converted the museum into a laboratory for real-time experiments in social relations and a very vulnerable site for cultural creation and presentation. However, my point is that the atmosphere of spontaneity and uncertainty created by the installation was precisely its message. It aimed to abrade the institution's climate of regulation, producing instead a form of syncopation, wherein existing social, temporal, and programmatic rhythms were destabilized. We get a sense that we can very easily belong there. It's pluralistic as opposed to excessively individual, and we are drawn to it. We want to be its subjects. As Joseph Nye states, democracy cannot be created through coercion. And I think given our current political moment, the concept of soft power gives a renewed sense of vitality and agency to the project of aesthetics and to cultural producers as a whole. We seem to be facing a cultural crisis of identity, not too dissimilar to the historical moment whose cultural objects we've been talking about for the past couple hours. There's both a kind of playful ambivalence to who we are, but also a simultaneous and serious reclaiming of identity politics in relation to charged social situations. Technology offers the capability for the documentation and distribution of social realities, but also the invention of new subjectivities. So likewise, we find ourselves within an architecture these days that operates at myriad scales. As we saw earlier, it has an ability to cloak with everything else. Its casualness and inconspicuousness that at the same time is referencing major systems of power and information, its ability to slip in so casually is what confers its agency and power. It's wedged in very strange, inconspicuous places sometimes, and I think paying attention to its participation in these seemingly latent but insidious forms of power is a way that we in turn can acknowledge architecture's own power. Thus, the concept of the free radical has particular resonance for architecture today. Can we imagine an architecture of particularized, politicized actions? In my view, these sets of practices foreshadowed a new mode of critical practice that would take shape nearly 30 years later and that we're still struggling to formulate today. A post-critical logic of temporary, ephemeral intervention that somehow anticipates the rapid flow of logistics, connection, and obsolescence that would eventually come to be associated with global capital. So if the architects of hippie modernism proposed a utopian vision, their reliance on institutions and their reappropriation of technologies and distribution systems were pivotal to their ability to reimagine new societies that might be possible here and in the future. To complicate the notion of what it means to be radical, one could argue that hippie modernism as an ethos actually seemed to epitomize rather than unhinge the assumptions and ideals that were integral to the narratives of the modern movement. And this is, I think, why the title of the show is so brilliant. Historians like Sarah Goldhagen have very eloquently summed up the kind of following points around how we think about modernism. The first being abstraction and the rejection of historical precedents. Second, the use of new technologies and new materials. Third, programmatic functionalism. I mean, what can be more pragmatic than the DIY dome as your kind of primitive hut? Fourth, the reflexive affiliation after the Second World War of architectural activity with progressive political ideals. And lastly, the effacement of high and low, which architects like Le Corbusier and Walter Gropius sought to achieve through mass production. Of course, many historians have since refuted this very synthetic narrative, and rightly so, but still, I think we're left to contend with these myriad contradictions of hippie modernism's spatial experiments, which at once participated and rejected its foundational modernist roots. And this brings me to my last point. So thus in closing, I'd like to offer a model taken from the French curator and art theorist Nicolas Bourriaud, and that is of the radicant. It's a term designating an organism that grows its roots and adds new ones as it advances. So in a time of post-studio, post-production, post-architecture, I think a new pragmatism of spatial practice would consider not only a localized set of aesthetics or a set of processes, but would also acknowledge the ethics of one's métier. This form of radicality would operate towards a positive, constitutive model of utopia, which, according to Paul Ricoeur, is characterized by its capacity to project imaginative changes to existing circumstances, but with an intention to form rather than deform social imagination. Likewise, this talk and this model is a comment about interpretation itself. And here I reference the work of literary theorists Stephen Knapp and Walter Ben Michaels, who produced an essay called Against Theory in the early 80s. And their point is, how we interpret often filters what one does with an interpretation. Interpretation is very much like that status of information these days. Rather than take architecture as intentionless meaning, let's assume that meaning and intention are one and the same. And by intention, I'm not referring to the rhetoric of what an architect says, but what she does. Instead, this involves taking architecture's arrangements and its relationship to its context, rather than assuming it's an accident, as a set of architectural actions. We need to look at how larger intentions or structural frameworks put pressure on more local intentions or architectural effects. For there's a politics, in my view, to identifying a set of symptoms in the world, and representing it and delineating it as a subject for our attention also produces a politics. Thank you.